Samuel Reed just wanted a quiet cup of coffee, but instead, he was publicly humiliated by the racist owner of a small-town cafe. Little did the owner know, Samuel's daughter had a plan that would change everything and leave the entire town speechless. But how does she do it? And what shocking twist awaits this narrow-minded businessman? Before we continue, let me know where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments below. You won't believe what happens next. Samuel Reed's weathered hand trembled as he reached for the coffee shop door. The familiar scent of freshly ground beans wafted through the air, a stark contrast to the acrid taste of humiliation rising in his throat. He paused, his fingers hovering over the handle, steeling himself for what lay ahead. The bell chimed as he entered, and the bustling chatter inside Caldwell's coffee shop came to an abrupt halt. All eyes turned to the dignified black man in his pressed shirt and polished shoes, a relic from a time when respect was earned through hard work and integrity. Rick Caldwell's voice cut through the silence like a rusted blade. "We don't serve your kind here, old man. Can't you read the sign?" Samuel's gaze drifted to the handwritten placard in the window. "No service to coloreds." The words, though faded, still carried the weight of generations of prejudice. "I can read just fine, Mr. Caldwell," Samuel replied, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I taught half the people in this room how to do so." A few patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, averting their eyes. Others stared openly, a mix of curiosity and shame etched on their faces. Rick stepped out from behind the counter, his pot belly straining against a greasy apron. "Don't care if you taught the whole damn town. Rules are rules. Now get out before I call the sheriff." Samuel stood his ground, shoulders straight, chin lifted. "I fought for this country, Mr. Caldwell. I've lived in this town my entire life. I have as much right to be here as anyone else." "Your kind always pulling that veteran card," Rick sneered. "Well, guess what? My daddy fought too, and he'd roll over in his grave if he saw me serving you in his shop." The tension in the room was palpable, a suffocating blanket of unspoken history and unresolved pain. Samuel's eyes scanned the familiar faces, former students, neighbors, even a few he'd considered friends. Not one spoke up in his defense. With a deep sigh, Samuel turned to leave. As he reached for the door, a gruff voice called out from the corner, "Hey, Sam, wait up, I'll join you." Jackson Tate, a fellow Vietnam vet with a prosthetic leg and a perpetual scowl, pushed himself up from his seat. He tossed a few crumpled bills on the table and limped toward Samuel. Rick's face reddened. "Sit your ass back down, Jackson. You're welcome here." Jackson spat on the floor. "Not if my friend ain't. Keep your damn coffee." The two men exited the shop, the bell's cheerful jingle a mockery of the scene that had just unfolded. As they walked down the street, Samuel's composure finally cracked. "I thought things had changed, Jack. I really did." Jackson clapped a hand on his friend's shoulder. "They have, Sam. Just not enough. Not yet." Across town, Dr. Monique Reed's phone buzzed insistently. She glanced at the caller ID, surprised to see Jackson Tate's name flashing on the screen. "Jackson, is everything all right?" The old veteran's voice crackled through the speaker. "It's your dad document. That bastard Caldwell just threw him out of coffee shop. It ain't right what happened." Monique's grip tightened on the phone. "He did what?" As Jackson recounted the incident, Monique's free hand curled into a fist. She'd fought against injustice her entire career, but this was personal. "Thanks for letting me know, Jackson. I'll take care of it." She ended the call and immediately dialed another number. After a few rings, a familiar voice answered. "Mayor Dawson speaking." "Emily, it's Monique Reed. We need to talk about Rick Caldwell and his coffee shop." The mayor sighed heavily. "What's he done now?" Monique relayed the story, her voice tight with controlled anger. "This can't continue, Emily. It's 2023. For God's sake. How are we still dealing with this kind of blatant racism?" "I know, Monique. Believe me, I know. But Rick's got friends on the council. His family's owned that shop for generations. It's complicated." "Complicated?" Monique's voice rose. There's nothing complicated about basic human decency. We need to do something. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. What did you have in mind? Monique took a deep breath. An idea forming. I want to buy the shop. Buy it. Monique, that's the only way to ensure this doesn't happen again. We'll turn it into something positive for the community. A place where everyone is welcome. Mayor Dawson's voice was hesitant. Rick will never sell to you. Then we'll make him an offer he can't refuse. Use eminent domain if we have to. This isn't just about my father, Emily. It's about every person of color in this town who's been made to feel less than human. The mayor was silent for a moment. All right, I'll see what I can do to support you, but be prepared for a fight. Rick won't go down easy. Good, Monique said, a hint of steel in her voice. Neither will I. The next evening, Meadowbrook's town hall was packed to capacity. The air buzzed with tension as Mayor Dawson called the meeting to order. Ladies and gentlemen, we're here tonight to discuss recent events at Caldwell's coffee shop and to address concerns about discriminatory practices in our community. Monique stood, her presence commanding attention. Thank you, Mayor Dawson. I'd like to start by sharing what happened to my father, Samuel Reed, yesterday afternoon. As she recounted the incident, murmurs of disbelief and anger rippled through the crowd. Rick Caldwell, seated in the front row, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. This isn't an isolated incident, Monique continued. For years, people of color in Meadowbrook have been treated as second-class citizens. It's time for that to change. Rick jumped to his feet. Now, wait just a minute. You can't come in here and start dictating how I run my business. That shop's been in my family for generations. Monique turned to face him, her voice calm but firm. And for generations, it's been a symbol of division in this town. I'm offering to buy your shop, Mr. Caldwell, to turn it into something that can heal our community instead of tearing it apart. Rick's face flushed red. You think you can just waltz in here with your fancy doctor title and your big city ideas and take what's mine? This is my livelihood. Your livelihood. Monique's eyes flashed. What about the livelihoods of every person you've turned away? Every customer you've lost because of your bigotry? The room erupted into chaos, with people shouting over each other. Mayor Dawson banged her gavel repeatedly. Order. We will have order. As the noise died down, a soft voice spoke up from the back of the room. I think it's a good idea. All heads turned to see Martha Caldwell, Rick's wife, standing nervously. Rick's jaw dropped. Martha, what are you doing? Martha stepped forward, her voice growing stronger. I'm tired of living with this hate, Rick. Dr. Reed is right. It's time for a change. The room fell silent, the weight of Martha's words hanging in the air. Rick stared at his wife, betrayal etched across his face. Monique seized the moment. Mr. Caldwell, I'm prepared to offer you fair market value for the shop. This isn't about taking something from you. It's about creating something better for all of us. Rick's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. You can't do this. You can't just erase my family's history. We're not erasing anything, Monique replied, her tone softening. We're writing a new chapter, one where everyone has a place at the table. As the meeting adjourned, Monique found herself surrounded by supporters. But amidst the congratulations, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this was just the beginning of a long, difficult journey. Later that night, as Monique pored over legal documents, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. This is Martha Caldwell. We need to talk. Meet me at the park tomorrow at noon. Come alone. Monique stared at the message, her mind racing. What could Rick's wife possibly want? And why the secrecy? As she set her phone down, Monique gazed out the window at the sleeping town. Meadowbrook was on the cusp of change, but change never came easy. She had a feeling that the real battle was just beginning. The sun had barely crept over the horizon when Monique Reed arrived at the construction site of what would soon become the Learning Corner. She paused, taking in the skeletal framework of the building, a stark contrast to the weathered storefronts lining Meadowbrook's main street. A chill ran down her spine as she noticed the shattered glass littering the ground. Fragments of what was once a brand new window glinted in the early morning light. "Damn it," she muttered, pulling out her phone to call the contractor. As she waited for an answer, a familiar figure limped into view. Jackson Tate's face was a mask of concern as he approached. "Mornin'. Document looks like we had some unwelcome visitors last night." Monique ended the unanswered call with a frustrated sigh. "This is the third time this week, Jackson. We can't keep replacing windows every other day." Jackson's eyes narrowed. "You think it's Rick?" "Who else? He's been fighting this every step of the way." The old veteran shook his head. "Hatred's a poison. Document eats a man from the inside out." Monique's phone buzzed. A text from her father. "Don't come by today. Not feeling well." She frowned, worry creasing her brow. Samuel had been withdrawing more and more lately, the weight of recent events taking their toll. "I need to check on Dad," she said, pocketing her phone. "Can you keep an eye on things here?" Jackson nodded, his prosthetic leg creaking as he shifted his weight. "Go on. I'll make sure no one else decides to play baseball with our windows." Across town, Rick Caldwell paced the length of his living room, a crumpled legal document clutched in his fist. Martha watched from the kitchen doorway, her face a mixture of concern and resignation. "It's not right, Martha," Rick fumed. "That shop's been in my family for generations. How can they just take it away?" Martha's voice was soft but firm. "They didn't take it, Rick. You sold it." Rick whirled on her. "Because I had no choice. That uppity doctor and her cronies on the town council, they backed me into a corner." "Maybe it's time to let go," Martha suggested gently. "Maybe this change could be good for Dash." "Good." Rick's face reddened. "There's nothing good about having everything you've worked for stripped away by people who don't belong here in the first place." Martha flinched at the venom in his words. She opened her mouth to respond, but thought better of it. Instead, she retreated to the kitchen, leaving Rick to his anger. As the door closed behind her, Rick's shoulders sagged. He collapsed onto the couch, the fight draining out of him. For a moment, doubt flickered across his face, but then his jaw set, determination hardening his features. "This isn't over," he muttered to himself. "Not by a long shot." Monique knocked on her father's door, concern etched on her face. When Samuel finally answered, she was struck by how tired he looked. "Dad, are you okay?" Samuel managed a weak smile. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a little under the weather." Monique followed him into the living room, taking in the unwashed dishes and unopened mail. This wasn't like her father at all. "Dad, talk to me. What's going on?" Samuel sank into his favorite armchair with a heavy sigh. "I appreciate what you're trying to do, Monique, but maybe it's best to let sleeping dogs lie." Monique knelt beside him, taking his hand. "What do you mean?" "All this fuss over a coffee shop. It's stirring up old wounds. People are angry. I don't want to see you get hurt because of me. This isn't just about you, Dad. It's about making things right for everyone in this town who's ever been treated the way Rick treated you." Samuel's eyes were distant. "Some things don't change, baby girl, no matter how hard we try." Monique squeezed his hand. "That's where you're wrong, Dad. Things do change, but only if we're brave enough to make them." As the days passed, strange occurrences continued to plague the construction site. Tools went missing, deliveries were mysteriously canceled, and workers began quitting without explanation. Monique stood in the half-finished interior of the learning corner, frustration etched on her face as she listened to yet another contractor back out of the job. "I'm sorry, Dr. Reed," the man said, not quite meeting her eyes. "It's just, well, there's been talk. Some folks aren't too happy about this project. We can't afford to lose business over it." Monique bit back a sharp retort. "I understand. Thank you for your time." As the contractor left, Mayor Emily Dawson entered, her face a mask of concern. "Monique, we need to talk. Rick's filed a lawsuit claiming the sale was coerced. He's demanding the property be returned to him." Monique's fists clenched at her sides. "He can't do that. The sale was completely legal." Emily nodded. "I know, but he's got friends on the council. They're pushing for an emergency meeting to discuss revoking your permits." This is ridiculous, Monique fumed. How can they dash? A crash from outside cut her off. They rushed to the window to see Rick Caldwell stumbling away from a pile of broken lumber, Jackson Tate hot on his heels. "You son of a bitch!" Jackson roared, tackling Rick to the ground. The two men grappled in the dirt, a tangle of flailing limbs and angry shouts. Monique and Emily raced outside. "Stop it, both of you!" Monique yelled, trying to pull Jackson off Rick. Sheriff Bill Hargrove's cruiser screeched to a halt nearby. He jumped out, hand on his holster. "Break it up now." As the dust settled, Rick nursed a bloody nose while Jackson glared daggers at him. The sheriff looked between them, his expression grim. "Anyone want to tell me what's going on here?" Jackson spat on the ground. Caught this lowlife trying to sabotage the site. Again. Rick struggled to his feet, wiping blood from his face. "That's a lie. I was just walking by, minding my own business." With a crowbar. Jackson held up the tool he'd wrestled from Rick's grasp. Sheriff Hargrove sighed heavily. "All right, both of you cool it. Rick, I'm going to need you to come down to the station with me." As the sheriff led Rick away, Monique turned to Jackson. "Are you okay?" The old veteran nodded, his breathing ragged. "I'm fine, document. But this has got to stop. Someone's going to get hurt if we don't put an end to it soon." Later that evening, Monique sat in her office, poring over legal documents. A soft knock at the door startled her. "Come in," she called, surprised to see Martha Caldwell step inside. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Martha said, her voice barely above a whisper. Monique gestured to a chair. "Not at all. What can I do for you, Mrs. Caldwell?" Martha sat, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. I wanted to apologize for Rick's behavior and to offer my help." Monique's eyebrows shot up. "Your help?" Martha nodded, a determined glint in her eye. "Rick doesn't know this, but I've been keeping the coffee shop afloat for years. He thinks it's been turning a profit, but the truth is, I've been funneling my inheritance into it to keep it running." Monique leaned forward, intrigued. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I want you to succeed where I failed," Martha said, her voice growing stronger. "I thought if I just kept things going, Rick would eventually come around. But all I did was enable his hatred. It's time for a real change in this town, and I want to be part of it." As Martha spoke, Monique's mind raced. This could be the key to finally breaking through Rick's defenses, but it could also backfire spectacularly if not handled carefully. "Mrs. Caldwell, I appreciate your offer, but are you sure about this? It could cause a lot of problems for you and Rick." Martha's chin lifted, a spark of defiance in her eyes. "I've been living with problems for years, Dr. Reed. It's time I did something about them." Just as Monique was about to respond, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Mayor Dawson. "Emergency. Come to town hall immediately." Monique's stomach dropped. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Caldwell, but I have to go. Can we continue this conversation later?" Martha nodded, rising to leave. "Of course. And please call me Martha." As Monique rushed to town hall, her mind whirled with possibilities. Martha's revelation could change everything. But first, she had to deal with whatever new crisis was unfolding. She burst into the mayor's office to find Emily Dawson looking grim, Sheriff Hargrove at her side. "What's going on?" Monique asked, breathless. Emily's voice was tight with tension. "We've got a problem. A big one. Rick's friend, Tom Hollister, has been caught trying to bribe a town official to revoke your permits." Monique's heart sank. "Can he do that?" Sheriff Hargrove stepped forward. "Not legally, he can't. But Hollister's got deep pockets and a lot of influence. This could tie things up in court for months, maybe years." Monique felt the weight of everything crashing down on her. The sabotage, the lawsuit, and now this. It was almost too much to bear. But then she thought of her father, of Jackson, of every person in Meadowbrook who had ever been made to feel less than human. She thought of Martha Caldwell, finally finding the courage to stand up for what was right. Monique straightened her shoulders, a fire blazing in her eyes. "Then we fight. Whatever it takes, we see this through." As she spoke, a crack of thunder shook the building. Rain began to lash against the windows, as if nature itself was echoing the turmoil in Meadowbrook. The storm had arrived, both literally and figuratively, and Monique Reed was ready to weather it. The storm that had been brewing over Meadowbrook for weeks finally broke. Rain lashed against the windows of the half-finished learning corner as Monique Reed paced inside, her phone pressed to her ear. "What do you mean the permits are on hold?" she demanded, her voice echoing in the empty space. Mayor Emily Dawson's sigh crackled through the speaker. "Tom Hollister's been making waves, Monique. He's got half the council convinced this project is bad for business." Monique's free hand clenched into a fist. "It's a community center. For God's sake. How is that bad for business?" "You know how Tom operates. He's painting this as an attack on local values, saying it'll drive away tourists who come for the small-town charm." Monique scoffed. "Small-town charm? Is that what we're calling bigotry these days?" A crash of thunder punctuated her words, making her jump. Through the rain-streaked windows, she caught sight of a familiar figure hurrying down the street. Her father, hunched against the downpour, looking smaller and more fragile than she'd ever seen him. "I have to go, Emily. Keep me posted." Monique rushed outside, calling out to her father. "Dad, what are you doing out in this weather?" Samuel Reed turned, his eyes haunted. "Monique, I was just—" She ushered him inside, concern etched on her face. "Dad, you're soaked. What's going on?" Samuel's gaze darted around the unfinished interior of the learning corner. "I shouldn't have come. This was a mistake." "What are you talking about?" He met her eyes, his own brimming with unshed tears. "I overheard some folks at the grocery store. They're saying terrible things, baby girl. About you, about this place. They're saying we're trying to erase their history, that we don't belong here." Monique's heart clenched. "Dad, you can't listen to them. We're doing the right thing here." "Are we?" Samuel's voice cracked. "Look at what it's doing to this town. To you. Maybe it would have been better if I just kept my head down like always." The defeat in his voice hit Monique like a physical blow. Before she could respond, the door burst open, admitting a drenched and fuming Jackson Tate. "We've got trouble," he growled, shaking water from his prosthetic. "Rick's rallying people at the town square. It's getting ugly out there." Monique's mind raced. "We need to do something. Dad, stay here where it's dry. Jackson, can you dash?" A rock smashed through the window, showering them with glass. Samuel stumbled back with a cry of alarm. "Dad!" Monique rushed to him, checking for injuries. Jackson limped to the window, peering out into the rain. "It's a group of kids. Looks like they're being egged on by some of Rick's cronies." Monique helped her father to his feet, anger and determination warring in her chest. "This ends now." She strode towards the door, but Samuel caught her arm. "Monique, please, don't make this worse." She turned to him, her voice soft but firm. "Dad, do you remember what you taught me when I was little? About standing up for what's right, even when it's hard." Samuel nodded, a flicker of his old strength returning to his eyes. "Well, this is me standing up," Monique continued. "Not just for us, but for everyone in this town who's ever been made to feel less than human. It's time we showed them what real community looks like." With that, she stepped out into the storm, Jackson at her heels. The town square was a scene of chaos. A crowd had gathered despite the rain, their angry voices rising above the thunder. At the center stood Rick Caldwell, his face twisted with rage as he shouted into a megaphone. "This is our town. We won't let them change who we are." Monique pushed through the crowd, her voice cutting through the din. "And who are we, Rick? A town that turns its back on its own people, that values hate over progress." Rick whirled to face her, his eyes wild. This is all your fault. You come in here with your fancy ideas, trying to tell us how to live our lives." "I'm not telling anyone how to live," Monique shot back. "I'm trying to create a place where everyone can live together without fear or shame." The crowd murmured, some nodding in agreement, others scowling. Rick advanced on Monique, megaphone forgotten. "You think you're so much better than us, don't you? with your big city education and your high and mighty attitude. This isn't about being better, Monique said, standing her ground. It's about being equal, about recognizing that every person in this town has value, regardless of the color of their skin or where they come from. Rick's face contorted. With a roar of frustration, he lunged at Monique, his fist raised. Time seemed to slow. Monique braced for the impact, but it never came. Instead, a figure stepped between them, catching Rick's fist mid-swing. Sheriff Bill Hargrove's voice cut through the shocked silence. That's enough, Rick. You're under arrest. As the sheriff cuffed a sputtering Rick, Monique noticed Martha Caldwell standing at the edge of the crowd, her face a mask of sorrow and relief. The tension in the square deflated like a punctured balloon. People began to disperse, muttering amongst themselves. Monique caught snatches of conversation, some supportive, others still skeptical, but the blind anger seemed to have dissipated. As the rain began to let up, Monique made her way to Martha. Are you all right? Martha nodded, her eyes never leaving her husband as he was led to the police car. I'm sorry, Dr. Reed. I should have done something sooner. You're doing something now, Monique said gently. That takes courage. Martha turned to her, resolve hardening her features. There's something you need to know. About Rick, about the coffee shop, about everything. Over the next hour, as the storm clouds began to break, Martha poured out years of secrets. How she'd been secretly keeping the coffee shop afloat with her inheritance. How Rick's bravado and bigotry had been a mask for his own insecurities and failures. How she'd reached out to Monique not just for the town's sake, but for Rick's, hoping that losing the shop might finally force him to confront his demons. As Martha spoke, pieces began to fall into place for Monique. The sabotage, the desperate attempts to cling to power, it all stemmed from a man terrified of losing the only thing that gave him a sense of worth. I thought if I just kept things going, he'd eventually come around, Martha finished, her voice heavy with regret. But all I did was enable him. It's time for a change, for all of us. Monique squeezed Martha's hand. It's never too late to do the right thing. Thank you for telling me this. As they parted ways, Monique caught sight of her father standing in the doorway of the learning corner. She made her way to him, suddenly exhausted. You okay, baby girl? Samuel asked, concern etched on his face. Monique nodded, leaning against him. I think so. It's been a day. Samuel chuckled softly. That it has. You know, watching you out there, it reminded me of your mother. She never backed down from a fight either. Monique felt tears prick at her eyes. I miss her, Dad. I wish she could see what we're trying to do here. She can, Samuel said, his voice firm. And she'd be proud of you, just like I am. As they stood there, the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting a warm glow over the town square. Monique looked out at the scene, the broken glass being swept up, neighbors talking in hushed tones, Martha Caldwell walking tall for the first time in years. It wasn't perfect. There was still work to be done, wounds to be healed. But for the first time since this all began, Monique felt a glimmer of real hope. Come on, Dad, she said, straightening up. We've got a community center to finish building. As they walked back into the learning corner, Monique's phone buzzed. It was a text from Sheriff Hargrove. Need to talk. Evidence of bribery involving Hollister. This goes deeper than we thought. Monique's breath caught. This could change everything, not just for the learning corner, but for the entire power structure of Meadowbrook. She looked at her father, busy examining the progress on the bookshelves. She thought of Martha, finally free from years of secrets. Of Jackson, standing tall despite his wounds. Of all the people in this town who had been silenced for too long. You okay? Samuel asked, noticing her expression. Monique nodded, a determined smile spreading across her face. Yeah, Dad. I think we're about to turn a corner. As she typed out a response to the sheriff, Monique felt a sense of purpose settle over her. The storm had passed, but the real work was just beginning. And this time, they'd face it together, as a true community. The sky over Meadowbrook darkened ominously as Monique Reed stood before the newly renovated learning corner. A crowd had gathered for the grand opening, their excited chatter a stark contrast to the rumbling thunder in the distance. "Looks like we might have to cut this short," Mayor Emily Dawson murmured, eyeing the approaching storm. Monique nodded, her heart heavy. After everything they'd been through, it seemed cruel for nature to intervene now. She caught sight of her father, Samuel, chatting with Jackson Tate near the entrance. The pride in Samuel's eyes as he looked at the building made all the struggles worth it. As Monique stepped up to the podium to begin her speech, a gust of wind nearly knocked her off her feet. The crowd gasped as a loud crack echoed through the air. "The scaffolding," someone shouted. Monique turned to see the temporary structure swaying dangerously. Without warning, it began to collapse, threatening to take the newly repaired roof with it. "Everyone get back!" Monique yelled, her doctor's instincts kicking in as she rushed to help evacuate the area. In the chaos, a familiar figure caught her eye. Rick Caldwell, out on bail and looking worse for wear, was pushing his way through the crowd, not away from the danger, but towards it. "Rick, what are you doing?" Monique called out, torn between confusion and concern. "I know how to secure it." Rick shouted back, already scaling the side of the building. "Used to work construction before I owned the shop." Monique's mind raced. This was the man who had fought her at every turn, who had nearly destroyed everything they'd built. And now he was risking his life to save it. "I'm going up there," Samuel's voice cut through her thoughts. Monique whirled to face her father. "Dad, no, it's too dangerous." But Samuel's eyes held a determination she hadn't seen in years. "That man needs help, and I know a thing or two about building myself." "You didn't raise a coward, Monique." Before she could protest further, Samuel was making his way up the scaffolding, his movements slow but sure. The wind howled as Rick and Samuel worked to secure the structure. Monique watched, her heart in her throat, as the two men who had been at odds for so long now fought side by side against nature's fury. "We need to anchor that beam," Rick shouted over the wind, pointing to a section that was coming loose. Samuel nodded, maneuvering carefully across the roof. "I've got it." For a tense few minutes, it seemed as though their efforts might be in vain. But slowly, surely, the scaffolding began to stabilize. As the last bolt was secured, a cheer went up from the crowd below. Rick and Samuel made their way down, both men breathing heavily. They stood facing each other, an unspoken understanding passing between them. "Thank you," Monique said, her voice thick with emotion. "Both of you." Rick looked away, clearly uncomfortable. "Couldn't let all your hard work go to waste, I suppose." The storm, as if satisfied with the drama it had caused, began to subside. As the clouds parted, revealing a brilliant sunset, the true impact of what had just occurred began to sink in. Martha Caldwell approached, her eyes fixed on her husband. "Rick, I don't know what to say." Rick met her gaze, his usual bravado nowhere to be seen. "You don't have to say anything, Martha. I know I've got a lot to make up for." Martha shook her head, tears in her eyes. "No, Rick. This is a start. But I can't be the one to save you anymore. You've got to find your own way now." As Martha walked away, Monique saw something shift in Rick's expression, a mixture of grief and, perhaps for the first time, genuine understanding. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. As the danger passed, the excitement for the grand opening returned tenfold. The learning corner, tested by both man and nature, stood as a testament to the town's resilience. As the evening wound down, Monique found herself alone with her father in the main reading room. "You know," Samuel said, running his hand along a bookshelf, "when you first told me about this idea, I thought you were crazy. Didn't think anything could change in this town." Monique smiled. "What about now?" Samuel chuckled. Now, I think maybe I was the crazy one forever doubting you." A knock at the door interrupted their moment. Rick stood in the doorway, looking more vulnerable than Monique had ever seen him. "Mind if I come in?" he asked hesitantly. Samuel nodded, gesturing for Rick to join them. Rick cleared his throat. I wanted to apologize. To both of you. What I did, how I acted, it wasn't right. No, it wasn't, Samuel agreed, his voice firm but not unkind. But what you did today, that took courage. Rick shook his head. Doesn't make up for years of being a fool. You're right, Monique said. It doesn't, but it's a start. She walked over to a small table in the corner, picking up a folder. Which is why I want to offer you this. Rick took the folder, confusion etched on his face. As he read the contents, his eyes widened. A job offer. Yeah. Monique nodded. We need someone to run the cafe portion of the Learning Corner. Someone who knows coffee, who knows the people of this town. But after everything I've done, why would you trust me with this? Monique's expression softened, because this place isn't just about books or coffee. It's about second chances, about people coming together and learning from each other. And I think you've got a lot to teach and a lot to learn. Rick stood silent for a long moment, emotions warring across his face. Finally, he extended his hand to Monique. I'd be honored, and I promise I won't let you down. As they shook hands, Samuel stepped forward. Funny how life brings you back to the same table, isn't it? Rick nodded, the weight of his journey clear in his expression. Yeah, it is. The next morning, as the sun rose over Meadowbrook, the Learning Corner opened its doors for the first time. Monique watched as people from all walks of life streamed in, old and young, black and white, those who had supported the project from the start and those who had once opposed it. She caught sight of Jackson Tate, deep in conversation with a group of young veterans. Mayor Dawson was there too, chatting with Martha Caldwell as they perused the local history section. And there, behind the counter of the cafe, was Rick Caldwell. He moved with a new sense of purpose, greeting each customer with a warmth that would have been unthinkable just weeks ago. As Monique took it all in, she felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see her father, his eyes shining with pride. You did it, baby girl, Samuel said softly. You really did it. Monique shook her head. No, Dad, we did it. All of us. She looked out at the bustling room once more, at the laughter and conversation filling the air. This wasn't just a building they had saved. It was a community they had transformed. As she joined her father to greet the day's visitors, Monique knew that the Real work was just beginning. There would be more challenges ahead, more hearts and minds to change. But for the first time in a long time, the future of Meadowbrook looked bright. And it all started with a cup of coffee and the courage to stand up for what was right.